Greetings, friends, and I'd like to welcome you to the conclusion of Chapter 13 in the Grand Design Exposed, authored by John Daniel. And before we continue on with the next section, we're going to back up at least one paragraph for continuity, just so we can kind of get a very brief explanation of what was covered in the last part. So let's go ahead and get started. What course, then, under these most perilous circumstances, would any sensible, level-headed, and intelligent businessman who had just invested the extraordinary sum of more than £40,000 in his Maryland venture have taken? Again, £40,000 back in this time was a lot of money. Rest assured, religious tolerance has never been offered by Rome out of benevolence, but is only stubbornly squeezed out strictly as a policy of sheer expediency. Give George and Cecil Calvert a little intellectual credit. Their course of action surely did not come from a love for their fellow Protestant colonists, but the hard cold fact that they were compelled to walk that narrow line of tolerance because it would have been totally stupid and foolhardy to have chosen any other path. That is, if they didn't want their venture to be shipwrecked, no matter what kind of saintly picture the legend makers want to paint of the Calverts. And this role of tolerance and low profile became a governing factor that was adopted and rigidly adhered to, again, for expediency's sake, by the Calverts and the top hierarchy of the Jesuits, even up until today. And again, I gotta emphasize the fact that in the book of Revelation, it talks about the dragon gave the beast its seat and power and great authority. Okay? And to better explain this, better than I have, Satan seems to work in two different strategies. He seems to work in the strategy of outright aggression and brute force. And then when that has failed, then he turns his tactics into a serpent, subtle, conniving. Think of, for example, you get a box of decon to kill mice, okay? And when you look at the contents of that decon container, you will find that almost all of the pellets in the decon container is virtually 99% natural and 1% poison. Okay, this has been the tactic switch by Satan through his agents via the Jesuit order and the Roman Catholic Church, is that they had to switch because they were already exposed for what they were for their outward aggression. Now they had to turn the tide, and now you're seeing the subtle play of the serpent being fulfilled subtly. So where once he was using brute force, Satan turned his tactics and did a reversal, and now he's basically turned face, and now he is acting as the subtle serpent. And once this basically accomplishes its aim, then he will turn back to that brute force. Okay? It's basically how he has always worked. If If one strategy didn't work, he would just simply flip his script a little bit, and then he would play the guise of the cunning and subtle serpent. And so basically, when you look at the characteristics of Satan, you can see the same characteristics in Romanism. It's the same concept. That's basically really the best way I could have, I can explain that to you. So, anyways, now we're going to continue in the closing section of chapter 13. Kicking off with the section, Jesuits and the Maryland Colony. Quote, while Lord Baltimore George Calvert was planning his Maryland colony, Henry More was among the most prominent Jesuits in England. At this time, the relations between the Lords of Baltimore and the Jesuits were most friendly. In fact, the latter seems to have played a very important part in planning and projecting the Maryland venture, as well as in acting as the spiritual advisors of the proprietaries. We may well believe that Jesuit More, who soon after became the provincial in England, was one of the chief counselors of Lord Baltimore in a project which was of deep interest to the Jesuits at that time, unquote. From the book Maryland, the Land of Sanctuary, pages 25 and 26. It was he, as George Calvert's chief advisor, this Jesuit More, and counselor, that guided him in the preparations of the Maryland Charter. So who was behind the scenes pulling the strings of George Calvert? It was the Jesuits. Another Jesuit that was quite conspicuous in his close association and affairs of Lords Baltimore George and Cecil Calvert and their plans for the Maryland colony was Andrew White. Some of these names might start to sound familiar. Who has also been called in Maryland history, quote, the Apostle of Maryland, unquote. As far back as the year 1605, when he was 26, he was engaged in the ministry in the English mission field, though not yet a Jesuit. He applied for admission, was accepted, and entered the novitiate. 12 years later, about 1620, and because he had previous theological education, he was not required the entire 17. He took his final Jesuit vows of profession. It was while Andrew White was in the English mission that he met Lord Baltimore and became acquainted with the plans for the American colony. There is record that while Lord Baltimore was in Newfoundland, he wrote to White, Andrew White. Upon returning from Virginia and receiving his Maryland grant, it was then that Jesuit Andrew White applied for the Maryland mission. The amount of historical letters and documents that have been preserved and are available leaves no room for doubt about the activities of the leading participants involved in the Maryland colony. The Jesuit Mucius Villalachie was general from 1615 till his death in 1645. There are several related letters from him to the English provincial, Jesuit Richard Blount, who held that office from 1623 till 1635, and then was succeeded by Henry More. Both of these men have previously been mentioned. Lord Baltimore George Calvert was completely captivated by the Jesuit order. They had wooed him, and he in return had successfully bailed them out of a troubled spot. He had the utmost confidence in their purpose, their schools, intellect, and methods. He respected and requested their help in drafting the Avalon and Maryland charters. He was sending 3 of his younger sons across the Channel, against the English law, to receive a Jesuit education. Now, he was requesting Jesuit missionaries to be sent to his Maryland colony. As an interesting note taken from the book History of the Society of Jesus in North America by Thomas Hughes, S.J., text, volume 1, chapter 3, page 206, quote, The Baron of Baltimore went off to Newfoundland. He abandoned it. He abandoned it in the autumn of the following year, 1629. Then we find that on the 24th of November, 1629, quote, 10 boys, 3 of them being sons of the Lord Baron of Baltimore, unquote, were in the English Channel, crossing over to St. Omer's College under the charge of Jesuits. The little vessel was overhauled and attacked by Netherlanders. An exciting scene followed. Nobody was killed, but the convoy of harmless passengers were robbed of everything, and then landed in safety on the 28th of the same month at Nieuwpoort, whence they reached St. Omar's on December 6th, unquote. Within the Catholic hierarchy, the participants involved in the Maryland mission had to work out all their plans, objectives, and stratagems, and then submit a report to their superiors. First a Jesuit in the mission field to his provincial, then to their general, and finally to the Pope, for approval, and then returned. Many of these correspondences are on record and still can be read today. Andrew White and 2 other men were approved for the Maryland mission. After Lord Baltimore's return from Virginia in 1630, there is much evidence to show that for those 2 years till his death, Andrew White was in close touch with him and had an active part in the plans for the new colony. It is a well-established fact that he wrote the famous Declaratio Coloniae, outlining the purposes of the colony and the terms and conditions offered to the settlers, which was published with copies in English circulated in English to attract colonists, while copies in Latin were sent to his superiors. Also, as part of their stratagem, to be able to answer their critics, a literal question and answer situation was written up covering the various objections that could have been raised, along with their deflecting and neutralizing effect answers. This paper is strongly believed to have been written also by Jesuit Andrew White, but whoever actually prepared it, it bore the stamp of approval of the English province and Jesuit Blount. It validly proves that the provincial of the Jesuits considered the charter of Maryland, that the Society of Jesus undertook to further and extend the planting of the colony, and with the full knowledge that the presence of religious toleration was to be adopted as one of the fundamental institutions of the province. So what was the fundamental institution of the province? Religious tolerance. Tolerance for one means tolerance for all. Folks, as great as this whole religious freedom thing sounds, you have to ask the question. If the kingdom of God was established on earth, let's just say we were living in the millennial reign, and if it holds out to be true that Jesus is going to be reigning with his saints on this earth instead of in heaven, I am not going to say either way. There are good arguments for both those camps, okay? But let's just say that we're in the millennial reign. Do you think that the King of Kings is going to allow religious tolerance in his kingdom? So this whole aspect of freedom of religion, whether you be Catholic, Buddhist, Islam, is that going to be allowed in the kingdom of Christ? What are the examples that we should be following? Not the kingdoms of this world, but we need to be following the examples that's going to come from the kingdom of Christ. And there is no room for religious toleration. So with that in mind, Also, you take into account that the Lord does not like his name being intermingled with falsehoods and false religions. So, again, as great as the freedom of religion and this religious tolerance seems to be, whose hand does it actually favor the most? It favors the hand of Satan and his agents. That's who it favors. You gotta remember what I just talked about. That Satan has decided to switch his tactics from a more aggressive and brutish mindset to the subtle serpent mindset. Okay? Things that are pleasing to the eye. Anyways, back to the reading. So that by necessity, toleration for Roman Catholics carried with it toleration for all Christians. Therefore, the design and integrity behind the Maryland project had the cooperation and approval of the Roman Catholic hierarchy. Jesuit Andrew White and Richard Blount, the English provincial, the General of the Society of Jesus, and the Pope. It is remarkable that the Roman Catholic Church, which never changes, changes often when it is to her advantage. George Calvert died April 15th of 1632, and his son, Cecilius Calvert, became the second Lord Baltimore. He was only 26 years of age when his father's mantle suddenly fell upon his younger shoulders, thrusting upon him full responsibility for carrying on the plans for the new colony. But he rose to the occasion superbly. He knew of his father's plans and had been taught well. He had been taught well Rome's procedure of conquest whenever she was in the minority. First, she begs for tolerance. Then, when tolerance has been granted, she begs for equality. After equality has been enjoyed, then Rome steps forth in her true colors and arrogantly and ruthlessly dictates her supremacy. Remember that. Remember this sentence. First, she begs for tolerance. So this is the key thing when it comes to the founding of America. Okay? First, and when you understand that all roads lead to Rome, okay? First, she begs for tolerance. When tolerance has been granted, she begs for equality. After equality has been enjoyed, then Rome steps forth in her true colors and arrogantly and ruthlessly dictates her supremacy. It's the whole grandfather clock scenario. Okay, it's also the same scenario that I just mentioned regarding the tactic switch of the devil, of Satan. You know, the whole ruthless aggression was not working anymore. And so obviously his agent, his number one agent, the beast, is in the minority. So she has to beg for tolerance. After this tolerance is granted, we move to equality. After equality has been enjoyed for how many years we are now in, eventually it's going to switch back to the other way of ruthlessly dictating her supremacy. All you have to do is look at Argentina, look at South America, look at how those people suffered, and look at a lot of these nations that are predominantly Catholic nations. What's their economies like? Who has superiority over there? So Cecil Calvert was determined to adopt and maintain toleration in the colony of Maryland as a design and first step towards achieving Catholic superiority. And either with or without the zealous Jesuits in the Maryland mission field, who had problems seeing the full strategic picture. Second Lord Baltimore Cecilius Calvert and his controversy with Jesuits. The relationship and admiration that bonded George Calvert to the Jesuits came from their wooing him and his first-hand experience working with them throughout his life's career. His son Cecil lacked that personal Jesuit touch, and even though he understood all too well and respected their great capabilities, it was more from a distance. When the great dispute arose between Cecil Calvert and the Jesuit order, caused by some of their demands and actions in the Maryland colony, his letters then are quite revealing. He certainly expressed himself quite frankly to his brother, Governor Leonard Calvert. First, he severely upbraids his brother for failing to follow his instructions. It is he that gives the directions and not his brother's place to question why. The Maryland colony and his own life was on the line, and so accuses the Jesuits of being his bitter enemies. Other clergymen can very well replace the Jesuits, but for Catholicism's sake, and of course his investments, the Maryland colony must survive to fulfill its destiny. The following is an excerpt taken from a letter in Letters of Cecilius Calvert to Leonard Calvert, November 21st to 23rd, 1642, Calvert Papers, pages 216 to 18. Quote, "For whatsoever you may conceive of them," the Jesuits, "who have no reason upon my knowledge to love them, very much if you knew as much as I do concerning their speeches and actions here towards you, I am, upon very good reason, satisfied in my judgment that they do design my destruction, and have too good cause to suspect, that if they cannot make or maintain a party among the English to bring their ends about, they will endeavor to do it by the Indians within a very short time, by arming them against all those that shall oppose them, and all under presence of God's honor and the propagation of the Christian faith, which shall be the mask and vizard to hide their other designs withal." Unquote. Pretty remarkable statement. Quote, "If all things that clergymen should do upon these pretenses should be accounted just and to proceed from God, laymen were the basest slaves and the most wretched creatures upon the earth. And if the greatest saint upon earth should intrude himself into my house against my will, and in despite of me, with the intention to save the souls of all my family, but withal give me just cause to suspect that he likewise designs my temporal destruction, or that being already in my house doth actually practice it, though withal he do perhaps many spiritual goods, yet certainly I may and ought to preserve myself by the expulsion of such an enemy, and by providing others to perform the spiritual goods as he did, who shall not have any intention of mischief towards me. For the law of nature teacheth this, that it is lawful for every man in his own just defense. Vim vier repelliere. Those that will be imprudent must be as imprudently dealt withal." Very unique. It is very interesting how Catholic authors and historians try to patch up and smooth over this most glaringly bitter and sharp controversy between Cecil Calvert and the Jesuits. Cecil Calvert was fighting for his very life and substance, yet the Jesuits in Maryland could have cared less about his personal predicament. But like a true Jesuit or programmed robot, their only concern was to ramrod their sacred policies through, regardless of the cost. Exasperated, Cecil appealed to the general of the Jesuits. Only then, After the problems were fully reviewed and the general decided in Lord Baltimore's favor, did he get any relief of satisfaction from the Jesuits in Maryland to obey his request, though hostilely complied with. Hostilely complied with. But through their folly, he lost his Maryland charter anyhow, and was lucky that that was all. It seems that, though the Jesuits general, Cecil Calvert, and the Jesuits in the Maryland mission field were all striving for the same common goal, only the general and Cecil understood the pre-planned course of action that had to be rigidly followed if they were going to successfully reach that goal. So, by an order from the general, the course of those in the mission field was altered. From then on, even though the Jesuit influence was subduedly felt among the English North Americans, it came later through another channel, too. So basically, in a sense, I mean, obviously, it seems like there was no love lost between Cecil Calvert and the Jesuit order, but on the contrary, he really didn't have no choice but to comply if he was going to save his Maryland colony, in which he eventually lost the charter because he was a bad boy, okay, and he wasn't innocent either. But at the same time, you also gotta bear in mind the whole Hegelian principle here. You also gotta bear in mind how the Jesuits operate, where they will take the side of the enemy as long as, here comes a famous quote, the ends justifies the means. And the ends is basically everything and all for Rome. Anyways, back to the book. It's a pretty sad situation when Jesuits stealthily use religion as a means to gain sympathizers and to infatuate so many under their spell, like a bully, perhaps, who, for those fortunate enough to wake up, will find themselves in a one-way love affair, being used only as a disposable tool to achieve a Jesuit end. The resentment is not so much that the Roman Church is in total gross error according to the Scriptures, who haughtily claims to be the sole possessor of religious truth, while scorning and branding those that disagree as heretics, which is bad enough, and for many, in spite of all this, would still agree to live in peace with her. But the fierce resentment comes from Rome righteously wanting to jam her garbage down others' throats with either accept it or be eliminated ultimatum. And though she may be hiding her true colors for the moment, don't be fooled, they will definitely soon appear. In spite of twice having his colony wrenched from him due to his Catholic religion, Cecil Calvert surprisingly regained it and lived almost 20 years after to see it flourish, grow, and prosper until his death. This has to say much about a couple of points when considering that England had just ended a civil war that swirled around just such Protestant Catholic issues. First, that the Puritan government and Oliver Cromwell were not quite as tyrannical and intolerant as has been painted by the Catholic hierarchy. Or second, it strongly proves that regardless of being in the stronghold of Protestantism supreme, okay, the Catholic elite still had persuasive powers and influence to jockey things their way, if a little discretion was used. Discreetly driving a Catholic wedge whenever there was a relaxed opportune time could gain for Rome by increments what a frontal attack would surely lose. This was the policy of Lord Baltimore Cecil Calvert. Actually, driving a Catholic wedge among the English was the purpose of all those involved. It was just the timing that caused such a bitter disagreement. The timing was a little off. Third Lord Baltimore Charles Calvert and his Maryland colony lost. His son Charles, however, Cecil's son, who was now governor of Maryland and became the third Lord Baltimore at his father's death, never seemed to understand the principles of discretion or toleration. He certainly never fit that quote-unquote sweet tolerant Catholic picture purposely painted by Romanists designed to rock dumb Protestants to sleep. He was a true stereotype son of Rome, spurred on by vicious hatred for anything Protestant, and urged on by the regrouped Maryland Jesuits. His policies jolted Protestants wide awake. See, we're still in the 17th century, and you got to bear in mind there was still a lot of persecution going around, and even though, but you're starting to see this whole aspect of how you can lull these Protestants to sleep. But don't think that since now they're starting to fall asleep, that one little jolt can wake them back up and to realize, hey, what's going on here? Well, this guy, Charles Calvert, was a little, dare I say, hyper. And that hyperness, his ADD, I don't know if he had ADD or not, but was enough to kind of wake the Protestants up a little bit. So anyways, his policies jolted Protestants wide awake. And for the third time, the Calverts lost their Maryland colony. But for those more sober minds plotting Rome's ultimate supremacy, failure burned even ever deeper into their consciousness. That to pretend benevolence and toleration seemed a more practical path to final victory. The partiality shown to Catholics by the third Lord Baltimore, Charles Calvert, was such an abrupt change of policy from his father's, and so obnoxiously anti-Protestant, that complaints began to pour into the authorities in England to such an extent that Charles felt he had better go to England personally and get things straightened out. He sailed in 1684, 8 years after his father's death, and was never allowed to return. King James II ascended the English throne the next year, in 1685, and Charles Calvert, seeking and expecting compassionate support from his very Catholic king, got the shock of his life. Uh-oh. You're being a little hyper there, Charlie boy. With pitiful whining and groveling, he pled that his administration had always been in strict conformity with the royal charter, and that there was no just cause for declaration for a forfeiture. But James II turned a deaf ear to his appeals and responded to the urgings of his Jesuit confessors and Baltimore's enemies instead. This gets interesting. The king promptly ordered the writ issued against the charter in April of 1687, but only because the king himself had to flee for his life was Baltimore's charter spared a little time longer. If Lord Baltimore Charles had a way of shaking Protestants out of their sleep in Maryland, King James II's shenanigans literally startled Protestants in England like a thunderclap. In fact, they were willing to risk another bloody civil war rather than be under the bondage of Rome. But James II thought more of his head than to stick around and fight, thus declaring herself forever Protestant. England began her quote-unquote glorious revolution. The Stuart dynasty, went into bitter exile, rallying and plotting for the next 60 years to gain their restoration. And in Maryland, bitter resentment was expressed in another way to show how they keenly felt. No sooner did the news reach Maryland that the Catholic hope in England had been put to flight than false rumors began to reverberate throughout the colony, stirred up to the highest pitch of excitement that the Maryland Catholic government, upheld by Catholics, had joined themselves with the Indians for the murder of all the Protestants in Maryland. That's right. These tales of terror and bloodshed, said to be inflicted by natives and Catholics, of burning houses, with women and children carried off, left Protestant settlers panic-stricken. Catholic historians delight in placing these false rumors on Protestants. That's basically what you hear today, that it was the Protestants' fault. Protestants did this, the Protestants did that. You know? You slap the bully around a little bit, they have to kind of turn around and do an about face and do things a little differently. And so they play the victim, when in fact, because of their Protestant in disguise mentality, they can divert the attention away from Rome and put it on the Protestant. And that's exactly what you read today. That it's the Catholics that are always the victims. The Catholics this. Oh, poor Catholics. Poor Rome. Catholic historians delight in placing these false rumors on Protestants. As for Lord Baltimore's representative in Maryland, they found themselves set at defiance by an intangible but seemingly ubiquitous enemy. The immediate effect was chaos and the fast giving away of the Maryland government foundations. But who had counseled King James II 2 years earlier to forfeit the Maryland charter but his Jesuit confessors? Had not Cecil Calvert wrote to his brother governor of his belief that Jesuit intentions, if pressed, would employ armed Indians to further their designs. Remember we talked about that? At the time of the Revolution in England, 1688, there were 6 Jesuit priests and 2 Franciscans in Maryland. Surely enough to fan a rumor if they had a mind to. As to who started the rumors, most likely it will always remain a mystery. But the fierce Catholic hatred and revenge felt towards England's glorious revolution and its humiliating dismissal of James II is not. In its wake, Charles Calvert was shorn of his proprietary rights, and Maryland was made a royal colony. It has been lamented as the harsh penal laws aimed at Catholics set in that Maryland, the land of religious liberty, which meant liberty for Romanism, began the darkest era of its history. At this juncture, England's glorious revolution permanently formed and molded attitudes and passions that would affect world events far into the future. To the mind of the Catholic aristocratic elite, proud, wealthy, powerful, educated, and influential, attributes better used to dominate rather than to be naturally submissive, the glorious revolution that had subjugated and humiliated them far beyond their noble dignity might be seethingly tolerated, but never, ever would it be accepted. It was Protestant, the common man's revolution and his religion. How could they? But to the Protestant's mind, after victory, what else was there but complacency? Yet nothing kept Europe in such a state of ferment and intrigue as the Jacobite partisans of James II exiled in France. Their passion to get revenge seemed to consume that very mind and soul. Secret conclaves sprung up like mushrooms in order to plot and scheme their invasions of England and develop their Catholic brand of Freemasonry. After several attempts to subject England to Romanism by force, only after the 1745 invasion attempt did it bring home to bear the futility of using force. but in the North American English colonies, particularly Maryland, there was a more kinder, gentler plan being worked out. Thus concludes Chapter 13 of The Grand Design Exposed, England's Religious War Expanded to New World. And we will pick up in the next chapter, Chapter 14, which is titled Jesuit-Inspired Carroll Family and Freemasonry Launch America Toward Its Secret Destiny. And believe you me, this chapter is going to be chocked full of a lot of unique information that I'm sure some of you may have never heard before. And this chapter is going to be quite the ride. It's going to be quite the ride. I mean, it's a pretty long chapter too. Again, it's got a lot of information in it. Trying to go through it right now and see how many pages it is. Yeah, I mean it's almost 40 pages long. You know, so this one could be a 4 or 5 part section. And really, after chapter 14, we only got like maybe about 60 or 70 pages left, and that will lead to the conclusion of this book. And then I'll probably take maybe about a week break and then get ready with the next reading. So, again, thank you for sticking with me. Truth be told, truth be known. Stay safe, God bless, and we will see you in the next reading. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.